Does green transportation take into account greenhouse gases from algae and other decomposing materials? I actually love this question in the comments because it gets at one of the more interesting myths to arrive recently on the subject of hydropower and ecology. First, let's talk about greenhouse gases specifically from algae. For one thing, algae blooms are gross, but they're also a very natural phenomenon that happens in any body of water that becomes stagnant or too warm. But while there's a lot of negative side effects with algae blooms having to do with toxicity in the water, damage to the climate from greenhouse gases isn't one of them. Remember, greenhouse gases are a problem because we're putting more in the atmosphere than the atmosphere is prepared to handle. But algae actually pulls carbon out of the atmosphere when it forms in the first place, which makes this whole issue in reservoirs a neutral part of the carbon cycle. Side note, there's actually been research done to see if algae farming can be used for carbon sequestration to fight climate change. Number 2, other decomposing organics. This is a new argument that is circulating about how artificial reservoirs could be bad for the climate because of all the organic matter trapped beneath the water. Trees, grasses, or even things washed downstream eventually do break down in the water and release greenhouse gases. And so if you quantify the surface area of a reservoir and extrapolate the potential for carbon emissions, it adds up to a fair amount of CO2. But there's a major flaw in this logic. The organic material in the reservoirs was all there naturally to begin with, which means at some point carbon was pulled out of the atmosphere to form those grasses, woody materials, or even animal carcasses. It's all a natural part of the carbon cycle. It's worth pointing out that all this organic material is going to break down into CO2 at some point eventually. Whether it happens in an artificial reservoir or happens in the natural river once it washes downstream, or even way downstream when it washes into the ocean, all living things eventually return back into the environment, which means that dams and reservoirs do not negatively affect the net CO2 in the atmosphere.